Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Introduction to Sociology. We are now beginning what is our final week of full lectures. Next week I'm going to be uploading a brief overview of the course, sort of a retrospective to talk about what we've covered, where we started and where we're ending, and kind of a send-off on the part of myself, Professor Edwards, as well as the teaching team. But this is going to be our final week of substantive material. So, as I mentioned last week, we are going to be closing out this course with a discussion of social movements. So, as I'm sure you got a sense of last week, social movements are a really theoretically as well as substantively rich topic in sociology. And as our theories of social movements expand over time, our understanding of how, when, and why people come together to change society around them has likewise expanded. Our body of knowledge on this topic has really grown over the past half century. So in last week's lectures on social movements, we discussed a lot of theory. And I presented several sort of competing theoretical frameworks that were all geared towards answering kind of a common set of questions. Those questions were, when do social movements emerge? That was really the heart of what we were talking about. And so in today's class, we are going to try to do a more deeper substantive dive into a set of social movements. So we're going to start off by doing a really brief recap of last week's discussion on social movements, just in case Thanksgiving and all the turkey has erased your memories of what we've covered of it. So after doing that brief recap, we're then going to discuss these theories in the context of actual social movements. So we're going to first start with the civil rights movement. And in particular, we are going to focus a reading that you did, a reading that was assigned, the Andrews and Biggs reading on the Black student sit-in movement. So having just discussed the civil rights movement, we are then going to discuss the Black Lives Matter movement and some ways that it can be sort of contrasted as well as compared with protests of the civil rights era. So having discussed these two movements, we're then going to return to some theory on how movements matter. So that is, we've spent a lot of time so far talking about factors that predict the emergence of movements, really how they get resources, what are the opportunities that allow them to arise. But the reason that people are organizing are in order to achieve a specific set of political goals. And we haven't spent a lot of time talking about what predicts when those movements are successful, or even kind of addressing the extremely thorny question of what constitutes a success. How do we even know when a movement has succeeded, right? Okay, so let's start off with a brief recap of what we covered last week. So we started off with kind of approaches to social movements that thought of them as collective behavior, that really kind of took as its exemplar of a social movement kind of almost instances of mob violence, and tried to answer the question, when do you get people in the streets, and when do you get people in the streets resorting to tactics of political violence in order to achieve their ends? As we discussed, the collective behavior approach to social movements really depicts social movements as these sort of emotional, largely irrational instances of crowd behavior. We then switched to more contemporary approaches to movements that, in many ways takes movements more seriously on their own terms, and that really grapples with the question of how difficult collective action actually can be to organize. So, with the perspective of collective action being a hard thing to achieve, when do movements successfully organize people into, unified collectives? So we discussed the following theories. So we discussed relative deprivation theory. So this was a theory that looked at how people perceive the unequal distribution of rewards in society. The idea being that people are going to be more likely to engage in a protest when there's something that changes that really kind of elevates people's perceived grievances, that makes them more likely to be upset with the distribution of goods in society, and therefore take action to try to amend that inequality. We then discussed resource mobilization theory. So resource mobilization sort of changes our focus from aggrievements to instead resources, saying that, actually one way to look at it is that in society there's always sufficient raw material for there to be social movements. There's, historically always been this kind of unequal distribution. So the real question is, when do people actually organize in order to address that inequality? So resource mobilization theory really puts the puzzle on when the movement gets resources, and we discussed the different kinds of ways that we can cash out resources. Think about resources regarding leadership resources, monetary resources, media resources, and as well as resources that have to do with the skills and knowledge of the protesters themselves. And finally, we discussed political process theories. So political process theories really focus on to the opportunity that movements have. So this, on this view, the thing that really matters for getting protesters in the streets isn't necessarily the kind of aggrievement, which might always be there, or the resources, but that the resources need kind of a moment to be utilized. And so political process theories really focus on what are the nature of these political moments. So things like economic crises, weakening of a previously extremely repressive regime, some sort of change, provides the opening for movements to start to emerge. So what we're going to do now is kind of start with the reading for today and think about these kind of competing alternative perspectives on movements and apply them to an actual movement. So for the reading for today, I assign, because it's an important reading in its own right, but I also think it's a really helpful and clear way of bringing these different perspectives into, not exactly a horse race, but sort of turning these perspectives into predictions and saying, what would we expect to see if resources matter? What would we expect to see if networks matter? And really testing those. So before getting into the reading, I wanted to start us off with a little bit of background. So we obviously won't have a ton of time in this lecture to do a deep dive into the entire history of the civil rights movement. And I'm going to go ahead and assume that many of you are already very familiar with this movement from your high school history courses or perhaps other classes that you've taken at NYU. So as I will fail to do justice to the civil rights movement in one lecture, we're not going to really dig that deeply into history. But that said, it's good to keep in mind how sociological approaches to the civil rights movement are likely going to differ from what you've heard before, particularly if what you've heard before comes from maybe a high school history class. So at least in my experience, high school history classes has tended to kind of give you the movement through the lens of its most famous, kind of most heroic figures. So, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, or Rosa Parks, those heroic figures are used to tell the narrative of the movement. By contrast, part of the reason I assigned the reading for today is that I want you to focus not necessarily so much on the civil rights movement leaders, but on the sort of thousands of people who you've never heard of, who made a decision to join this movement, to engage in protests, sit-ins, oftentimes at, major risk to themselves and their families in order to engage in this struggle to make America a more inclusive country. So how did all those individuals get involved in this movement? Okay, so when you hear civil rights movement, this is really an umbrella term for the activities of all those individuals and the instances of activism that that arose in order to secure full political, civil, and social rights for Black Americans. So this is generally a pretty long historical period between 1946 and 1968 that's called the era of civil rights movement, right? So So the movement and its diverse set of actors used a variety of approaches and different kinds of movement tactics as part of their movement repertoire. They used a variety of institutional means, so things like lawsuits and lobbying, as well as extra institutional means, things like mass direct action, protests, sit-ins, and even sometimes violence. So as we've discussed, so we have discussed the era of the civil rights movement earlier in this class. So we spent some time talking about the 1950s and the 1960s, but we did it in a very different context. So we talked about the 1950s and 1960s in particular in the context of the Great Compression. As you recall, there we were talking about kind of the lowering of wage inequality and the post-war model of work. But as we discussed, many, if not largely all, of the benefits of this economy, of this decreased inequality, of this rise in wages, those were really limited to a very particular sector of society, and that sector was largely white men. So New Deal policies, government programs, and private workplaces, all of these actively discriminated against Black Americans. So the segregation that resulted from this discrimination was a segregation that was both based on law as well as based on tradition. So you probably have heard these terms before, but de jure segregation refers to segregation that was legally enforced. For instance, southern states passed Jim Crow laws that enforced the segregation of the school systems, of buses, of hospitals, of libraries. So basically any kind of public service, any kind of government service was segregated based on race. So de jure segregation also led to housing segregation, for example. There were laws that banned Black Americans from living in the same neighborhoods as white Americans. And we've discussed this history earlier in the course when we talked about neighborhoods and stratification. Racial inequalities, of course, were also created by de facto segregation. So in northern states without Jim Crow legislation, blacks and whites lived in really segregated communities as, racial and racist housing policies, kind of things like restrictive covenants, racial zoning, all of these forced Black Americans into poor housing conditions, poor communities. So again, background that we have discussed earlier in this course. So one lens that we have learned from the previous class in our discussion of political process theory was just how important political openings can be to get a movement off the ground. So it's really changes in the political environment that are crucial and sort of in moments in which, for instance, a restrictive regime is loosened or there's a political crisis of some sort. It's these openings that change the political climate just enough so people who might have in the past not believed that any kind of movement was likely to be successful might have been seen as too impossible. These sort of changes can change the political calculus for activists, really creating an opening for the movement to get off the ground and gain steam. In the case of the civil rights movement, in the end of the Second World War, as well as several notable legislative changes, legal changes, all helped to set the stage for the movement for racial equality. So these were, first, after World War II, Black Americans found themselves sort of systematically excluded from many of the post-war economic gains that we discussed as accruing to white male Americans. So after World War II ended, you had this boom in manufacturing jobs, you had this increase in wages, you had relative job security, lower unemployment. So at the same time, you had a group of the population that was systematically excluded from these gains. So, in the language of relative deprivation theory, that inequality was increased. So in response to demands for Black Americans for equal employment rights, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued this executive order that was intended to ban racial discrimination in federal government jobs as well as in defense industries, which were really important not only during World War II, but in getting the American economy going again after the war. So while this law was limited in scope, so it was limited to the federal government, it was limited to defense industries, this executive order was crucial because it was the first presidential directive on race since Reconstruction. So in addition to, so after FDR's executive order, President Truman ended up appointing a president's panel on civil rights. In 1948, he signed an executive order to end discrimination and therefore racially integrate the military. And then finally, in 1955, Rosa Parks' famous act of civil disobedience really ignited the Montgomery bus boycott, which went on for a year and ended up with the Supreme Court striking down Alabama's ban on segregation laws. So, these are just some highlights of a really sort of rich and expansive history of the early part of the civil rights era. But the thing to get from this is that early executive victories and kind of these early successful movement events really helped to galvanize the civil rights movement, as well as kind of serve as a template for how the movement could then expand. The paper that we read for today was about one important part of the civil rights movement, the sit-in movement among Black students in the South that took place in 1960. So there were some sit-ins before 1960, and some of the movement continued afterwards, but was this period of kind of heightened activity during 1960. So you've probably all heard about the student sit-in movement due to the actions of the Greensboro Four. So these were the 4 teenagers in Greensboro, North Carolina, who sat at a lunch counter that was labeled for whites only. So their protest, over the course of days really grew into a protest that ended up in the streets of the city. And not only that, it was a protest, the form of which, so this sort of passive sit-in protest at a lunch counter, was repeated by hundreds of students over the course of the following days, which grew into thousands protesting in cities across the South. So while the Greensboro Four were an icon of the civil rights movement, that protest was just one among a series of sit-in protests organized by Black students, in states across the South. So this graph here is from the reading for today by Kenneth Andrews and Michael Biggs that maps out how these sit-ins diffused throughout the South in the 1960. So this figure, which is also from the paper, shows the number of cities that had sit-ins following the one in Greensboro on February 1st. So within 2 months of the initial sit-in, sit-ins had been organized in nearly every southern state in the U.S., with the exception of Mississippi. So on top of what we would now all refer to as kind of a viral spread of this new social movement tactic, these protests had clear consequences. Through the sit-ins, you had tens of thousands of Black Americans join and create new movement organizations, and many cities ended up reversing laws that had previously required segregated dining. So more of the success of these sit-ins helped solidify protest, as well as this movement tactic, as a really important part of activists' arsenal. It showed that protests could be effective. The Morris reading, which is on the recommended list for today, refers to the sit-ins as igniting a decade of disruption. Okay, so given all this, a question for movement scholars is how to explain the diffusion. That is, what explains the viral-like spread of this movement tactic? So we can see that the various answers that scholars have come up with to this question of how do tactics spread map on to the theories that we have discussed last week. So for instance, there are theories which are based on collective behavior that really saw the sit-ins as the independent and spontaneous production of students who were breaking away from existing organizations. They were really sort of moved to do this on their own. And to be clear, this reading isn't based, this reading doesn't come from scholars alone. It was picking up on the rhetoric that the students themselves used. So they presented this narrative, or they oftentimes presented this narrative of the sit-ins as this sort of organic, spontaneous protest, really, not only from the bottom up, but one driven by the collective behavior of student groups. They said they were reacting to a moral imperative, which gave the idea that maybe these movements arose with the kind of emotion and the kind of impulsivity that we've seen collective behavior theorists attribute to movements in the past. So by contrast, the reading that is listed in the syllabus, the recommended reading by the sociologist Alden Morris, uses an approach to movements that's based on kind of resource mobilization. It's arguing that, actually these student movements, even though they might have seemed like this kind of spontaneous event, were really based on a really important network of pre-existing social institutions that gave the students the resources to organize these sit-ins in the first place. So for example, in Morris's paper, he traces in detail the role that Black churches played in providing support for movement activists. Black churches gave movement activists not only places to meet and organize, but gave them also direct financial resources, gave them money. And probably the most important thing was that they gave movement activists a way to key into the Black community. They helped direct their sort of goals to expand their membership. So Morris also links these student movements with other existing organizations as well. So you had the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So he tries to show that it's not just that these movements erupted spontaneously, so he's pushing back against the collective behavior approach, but that they actually depended upon these deep pre-existing organizational resources that had been developed inside these communities organically. So in contrast, some scholars instead point to the importance of media coverage in spreading the movement. So media's reporting on the movement and its tactics on this theory could really inspire activists in other cities and help promote copycat protests. So on this view, it's not that resources weren't important, but that the thing that led to this kind of viral-like spread of this tactic was really importantly the media. So the paper that we read for today is attempting to adjudicate between these competing perspectives, and it's trying to do so using data based on where these sit-ins occurred. Where and when, sorry. So the paper by Andrews and Biggs tests these theories using data that's between February 1st and April 14th, and tries to identify which factors, sort of at a geographic level, which factors predict which cities or towns or localities ended up having a sit-in. So on this map, the areas with stars are geographic areas with sit-ins, and the areas with dots are geographic areas that did not have one. So they use regression analysis, what's called event history analysis, to figure out what predicts which areas had a protest. And just as a side note, there's kind of some equations, quite a few equations actually in this paper, and following the math here isn't particularly important. All you need to know is that they're trying to predict not only which locations had these protests, but when they were likely to have a protest, based on what has happened before. Okay, so what do they find matters? So in their results, they find evidence that aligns with several theories. So first, they say that an important thing predicting a sit-in in one city is a recent sit-in in a nearby city. So the first thing that we see is that actually movements diffuse. So it's not, this might be an idea that you had in the past, but here we see, particularly in this context in 1960s, being geographically located near a city that had had a protest made the city much more likely, put it at higher risk of having a similar protest in the following days. In addition, they find that resources matter. Not surprisingly. Having a larger Black student population, with the time and energy to put into protests is really positively associated with a city having a sit-in protest. And finally, they find that newspaper circulation has a large effect. So if a sit-in happened in a place with a newspaper with a wide circulation, it was much more likely that that protest would lead to subsequent protests in nearby cities. By contrast, being in the Deep South, in other words, sort of living under a more racially oppressive state, was associated with fewer sit-ins. So this is sort of evidence for the political opportunity model. If you're living in a state that is sort of powerful and repressive, you are less likely to see these sit-ins arise. So what about organizations? So here the authors find that organizations do matter, but they had mattered less than previous research had suggested. So the presence of some movement organizations, particularly organizations like CORE, did predict which cities would have a protest. But interestingly, having a chapter of the NAACP didn't really seem to predict movement activity once you controlled for all the other resources and media that we just discussed. Okay, and a final note on how media mattered. So the authors find that cities that had a local paper with wide circulation were more likely to set off subsequent sit-ins. So this graph here illustrates how local media ended up amplifying protests by reporting on recent local sit-ins. And as I had said earlier, it's areas that were close to an area that had previously had a sit-in that was likely to have a sit-in in subsequent days. So this data comes from several sort of major newspapers: the Atlanta Constitution, Charlotte Observer, Houston Chronicle, and Miami Herald. And basically it shows that whether a sit-in was mentioned by a particular newspaper really depends on whether that sit-in was close to the local paper. So this downslope indicates that sit-ins that were further away from the newspaper headquarters were much more likely to be reported. So that kind of shows you why it was the case that geographic areas that were kind of close to one another were more likely to cause the protest movement to spread. It's interesting to think how this aspect of media, one that is kind of really dependent upon reporting local protests, might differ from what we see today. Do we think, for instance, the Houston Chronicle is much less likely today to print news that's happening in New York than in Atlanta? Does that kind of geographic relationship still hold in media? My guess would be not, but it's an interesting question. Okay, so this paper has given you a sense of different theories that we've learned about being used to evaluate, this one aspect of the civil rights protests, the Black student sit-in movement of 1960. And what this paper does is it shows you that many of these different theories matter. It's not that one theory was right and the other theories were wrong. It's that actually, if you turn those theories into predictions, we see that many of them matter. So political opportunities matter. The repressiveness of a state mattered. Resources in the form of pre-existing organizations, particularly CORE, mattered. And finally, something that really mattered was media. And we didn't really talk about media that much in the previous class, but this is going to be something we're going to talk about not only for the rest of this lecture, but we're going to talk about in the context of conservative social movements, and particularly the Tea Party, next lecture. Okay, so with this analysis in mind, let's discuss the protests against police violence that we've seen build up over the last 4 years, which really ignited, as we saw, in cities this summer. And let's talk about them through the lens of analyzing them as a social movement. So I assigned the New York Times article on the scale and size of the protests because I wanted you to have kind of a historical lens. I wanted you to have a sense of the historical scale of these protests. So according to polls, anywhere between 15 to 26 million people participated in these protests, which would make them the largest protest in American history. Moreover, we now have the tools with which to analyze, the spread of these movements. So we can see that the spread of these protests show a kind of really rapid and high degree of diffusion, which spread more quickly and more widely than what we saw earlier with the sit-in movement. As we saw with the sit-in movement, though, the protests against police violence have been aided by the existence of a pre-existing organization. So particularly the organization Black Lives Matter has played a role in coordinating and resourcing these protests, even though they didn't necessarily direct many of them in these cities. And finally, we see kind of the role of social media in amplifying and allowing for the spread of this movement. So the fact that Black Lives Matter began as a hashtag really shows the centrality of media, and particularly social media, in amplifying modern day protests. So a little bit of history: the hashtag Black Lives Matter was actually created in 2013, and it was created by 3 women who founded the slogan after the murder of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman. But the hashtag really rose into prominence in 2014, and that was after the police shooting of Michael Brown. So one of the sort of incredible, particularly from a historical lens, aspect of this movement is how quickly its support for it has increased following these protests. So this graph here, which uses data from a civics poll, shows how support for Black Lives Matter kind of gradually crept up from 2014 over the course of 2019, but look at how it shoots up in the summer of 2020. So this is a real sort of sea change in public sentiment based on these protests. And it's not only public support. So state and cities have passed or are introducing policing bills that seek to amend policing by regulating the use of force, by banning chokeholds, by building agencies to investigate police misconduct. So this visualization shows here in blue states that in mid-June were in the process of introducing policing bills. And several states in green had bills passed a few weeks after the protests. So this is a remarkably quick success. And it's very clear that this movement is far from over. So, we'll have next year an updated map and see how many of these states have passed these kind of policing bills. So, as we saw in the paper we've just discussed, media matters for protests. But these protests are taking place in a media environment that is extremely different from that of the 1950s, right? So instead of local newspapers doing the work and amplifying the protests, now you have local newspapers, largely declining in America, which has really led to a nationalization of news. If I'd be curious to hear where most of you get your news sources from, but my guess would be it would be from a source that has kind of national range instead of a source that's only kind of covering a particular city and its surrounding locale. Also, in contrast to the 1950s, instead of a few kind of largely centrist television networks, you instead have a much more politicized news environment that, as we're going to discuss in the next lecture, has actively played a role in sometimes building social movements. So something we might ask ourselves is, what role is the media currently playing, and how has their coverage of the Black Lives Matter movement politicized the movement, amplified the movement, or maybe suppressed the movement? So this is likely not news to you, but news channels cover protests in very different ways. So this analysis here shows a spike in coverage of the protests across CNN, Fox, and MSNBC. And it shows the very different ways that protests have been framed. Particularly an outlier is Fox News, which has framed the protests through the lens of looting and riots instead of protests. So let's watch this clip discussing the media's coverage of Black Lives Matter protests.
Minneapolis on fire.
This is getting serious. Oh my goodness.
You watch the TV news.
We got a little bit of a fire breaking out to the left here.
And you're like, oh my goodness, all the protests are riots.
Vandalizing.
Fires have been started.
Things got out of control. And
we're not going to pay attention to the protesters in a city that has been racked by this violence. Who are marching peacefully and chanting names.
George Floyd! George Floyd! George Floyd! George Floyd! George Floyd!
Which is going to get more attention? A group of 35 people standing, chanting names, singing songs, doing the Cupid shuffle, as I saw one group of protesters doing, or 5 people on the ground bleeding and screaming and crying and throwing rocks? Our press is driven by eyeballs and attention and clicks and advertising and passion and raising the anxiety of viewers.
Dramatic images are money. They keep eyeballs on the screen, so they will constantly show action. You need to understand the limitations of those visuals.
I'm a college professor. My doctorate's in political science. I teach in a journalism department. I would say across the board, the coverage has not been very good. It's passing, but it's not very good. And the reason it's not very good is because there are not enough conversations about the roots of these protests.
What they're showing you is what is happening right now on the ground. What those visuals cannot tell you is the entire historical context that has led to that scene on the ground. And one thing that a lot of mainstream media doesn't do well is give you that full context. You can't untangle this moment from where we are just in this year, starting with February with the coronavirus, Ahmaud Arbery's lynching, having people in shelter in place, having people become angry that they are in shelter in place orders, having the economy, significantly slow down. There are so many events just since January that led up to this moment, not to mention the hundreds of years before that. This becomes a very complicated story.
Come to me right now. This woman just got tased.
Who is to blame for the violence? It is crazy that when we talk about destruction of property, that the presumption is that the unarmed people who are protesting are more likely to cause property destruction than the paramilitary cops who are showing up, because tear gas canisters are really hot. Flash bombs can start fires. Tear gas leads people to run and break through windows in order to hide and get help. I'm not saying the police are intending to cause damage, but if you're randomly shooting out tear gas, it's going to end up in the back alley with a pile of newspapers and some garbage. Does that mean that there aren't protesters who engage in destruction? Of course there are. To say that all this is turning into looters is like saying everybody at the party is a drunk driver. No, some people will leave and cause problems, but you can't say everybody at the party is the worst behaving person.
I think one thing that we actually don't do well and don't quite understand is anti-Blackness and how it works in our society, how it is in our language, and how it is used by mainstream media.
We have spent the last month watching protests who want the country to open up. And we saw images of these people screaming and yelling and spitting on police officers who were plainclothes officers. They weren't in riot gear, they weren't in masks. Now we see protests based on violence and death. And we see peaceful protesters come out, but suddenly the cops come out in riot gear and everything looks like, some sort of violent takeover in some 80s post-apocalyptic film.
What I'm reminded of are photos in New Orleans of white people leaving stores with food, and the headline being, "This is how people are surviving," and Black folks leaving the store with food and calling them looters. This is about a community that is treated differently by the police in our country. Just consuming the news right now in the next 5 days is not going to give you a good understanding as to why this is happening.
It's the emails I get where people say, well, I was in favor of the protesters, and then they turned violent, and it's a problem. Well, why are you more offended by people being violent in response to state-sponsored violence than you are by the initial act that caused everything?
Okay, so you might want to now take a moment and consider how this video squares with your own experience of the media's coverage of the protests. In what ways has the media that you've seen or that you've used characterized these protests over time? At the same time, as we've discussed throughout this course, the rise of social media and new media has given the movements themselves their own set of framing tools. So that is, the media covers these protests, but these protests and these social movement organizations can really use the media as a way to amplify their own message. So media is always a double-edged sword in this way. It both frames the movements as well as amplifies the frame that the movement itself provides. And that the movement Black Lives Matter started as a hashtag shows just how central social media has been to this movement. So Black Lives Matter online activities sparked immediate recognition from Congress members. So this is recognition limited to kind of the Twitter sphere, but this graph here, which is put together by Pew, shows Congress members who've posted on Twitter, I think, or on Facebook about Black Lives Matter in the 3 weeks following George Floyd's murder. So as you can see, engagement was mostly limited to the Democratic side of the aisle, but that there was a lot of engagement. Okay, so all of this raises a question that is really at the heart of social movement influences, and that is, how do movements matter? So it's too soon to fully address this question in response to Black Lives Matter. We've seen the movement's success in framing the issue of police brutality and violence. We've also seen their success in terms of changing on-the-ground policy with respect to policing practices. That said, the movement is still young, and it remains to be seen how this movement can further its influence under a Biden administration. But the question of Black Lives Matter's success raises a fundamental question for social movement scholars. So we spent all this time discussing theories of how and when social movement emerge, how they gain traction, and how they frame their messages. But what matters for most movement activists themselves are getting the things that they want. Getting policy changed, getting their voices heard, getting minds changed. So one thing that I want us to kind of end this class with discussing is to appreciate just how really hard it is to study how movements matter. So most social scientists like to see evidence that would like to, in order to say that a movement had changed a policy, they'd like to see evidence that if it weren't for the movement, the kind of policy change that happened, a change in policing law, for example, would not have ever happened. So they want to imagine the counterfactual and understand, if not for the movement, would we not have the policy outcome? And that is a tricky and in fact impossible thing to do, because we don't get to run history twice, right? We don't get to see what would have happened to policing laws if not for the protests this summer. So we're never going to know for certain that a movement was efficacious. One thing that makes it particularly difficult is that movements oftentimes respond or emerge in response to social trends which are pushing society in a certain direction in the first place. For instance, you might ask whether the movement for marijuana legalization is the thing that caused states to pass bills that made marijuana legal, or if it was kind of the general shift in public opinion towards, greater acceptance of marijuana that was the thing that really mattered. So, even if it weren't for these movements, at some point in the future, marijuana would have been legalized. Or maybe it's that movements matter for the timing of a policy. Maybe they allow a policy to pass more quickly than it would have otherwise. Another tricky issue is that movements will often change their goals and adjust their goals over time, sort of adapting their goals to the realm of possibility that's presented to them. In this case, the movement's goals shift along with its actions, so it might be hard to define whether a movement has succeeded when its own benchmarks have shifted from where they started out. Finally, scholars have examined the effectiveness of different tactics, some of which can generate unintended consequences. So there's been a big debate, for instance, about whether or not violent protest is more effective at getting a movement's goals realized, whether or not it brings about policy change more quickly, or whether or not it's ultimately less effective in the movement realizing its goals in whether or not it generates backlash across certain sectors of society. So we're not going to get into that literature here, but there's sort of evidence that supports both sides of that debate. There's evidence that violent tactics can speed up policy change. There's also evidence that violent tactics can alienate some sectors that would otherwise be sympathetic to protests. But, the answer to that is really going to depend on which movement one is talking about, the time period, as well as the particulars of the tactic. So an important part of understanding social movement outcomes is understanding the life of a social movement, so its progression from beginning to end. So social movements often begin the way that the sit-in movement began, or the way that protests against police violence began. Sort of an event that emerges as people are becoming aware of an issue, and those who care the most about that issue generate some protest or some organization. The second stage is when that sort of initial activity by very committed activists begins to coalesce. So when people who are aware of an issue begin to join and to organize and raise awareness among others, sort of taking that message and extending it to a wider population. A really important transition for movements is when they go from a grassroots movement to a more bureaucratized organization. So this is referred to as a process of bureaucratizing. And usually what you'll see here is that what began as a movement will build into an organization, sometimes with permanent staff, sometimes with organizational structure. And having this bureaucracy is actually really key to keeping a movement going. So several things can then happen to a movement. They can get some policy wins, they can suffer some failures, they can perhaps be co-opted by another organization or a moderating force and fade away. They can be repressed by a violent government regime and fade away as a result of that. Any of these outcomes will sort of eventually tend to lead to a movement decline. Okay, so whether or not a movement succeeds or not depends in part on what that movement's aims are. So different types of movements are going to want to accomplish different kinds of goals, and they may be differently able and likely to be co-opted or go mainstream or to succeed. So for instance, the sociologist David Aberle categorized movements according to what kind of change it is that they want to bring about and who it is that they are directing their efforts at. So movements on this kind of categorization can span from being revolutionary social movements, that is, movements that are attempting to radically change or reform society. So here you would have a movement like the Civil Rights Movement. But you could also have movements that are more reformative or social movements, movements that are seeking change but of a more limited nature, one that's seeking change within existing power structures. And you might think that these movements are more likely to be co-opted, for instance. Alternative movements are those that are focused not necessarily on government, but are on specific individuals. So here you can think about movements like Mothers Against Drunk Driving that are targeting a general population and that are trying to raise awareness. And then finally, there's also redemptive social movements, which are like religions or religious type movements that are trying to get individuals to adopt what is sort of a radically different belief style or system. So it's targeted in individuals, but also is based on radical change. So something that you might ask yourself looking at this chart is where you would classify some of the movements that we're familiar with today. Where would you classify the Black Lives protests? Or where would you classify the Women's March on this scale? Okay, so with that, we are going to end today's lecture. What we're going to be discussing next week is continuing our discussion of social movements, continuing applying the frameworks that we've learned about social movements, but applying them to conservative and right-wing social movements, and asking how do these social movements differ, and how are they similar to the movements that we have discussed today, as well as in last lecture. All right, so I'll see you here on Wednesday.